Right. Thanking God and praising Him for, among other things, this time, reminders in this chapter we want to call, or at least I'd like to call, remember, a term that's going to come up, I think, once, maybe a few more times. But other than the specific mentioning of the word remember, I think it is a theme that carries forward through the entire chapter that has a relatively famous reminder from God about midway through. But either way, Micah chapter 6 is going to begin with a hearing, or God calling things to hear the indictment that he has against his people. Remembering that the layout of Micah seemed to follow roughly the pattern of chapter 1. Speaking of the way that God was coming down to personally deal with the drama of his people. In chapter 2, he was talking about the way in which their ways had turned into the kinds of habits that were attracting the attention that he was about to bring to them. And then finally, the ways in which those habits seem to have worked their way into a heart condition that had them finding joy in the misery that, to a certain degree, they were either intentionally or unintentionally causing others. Chapter 4, however, talking about that concept of restoration that we sometimes see throughout the prophets, talking about the way that the mountain of the Lord was going to be raised higher than the other mountains, sometimes symbolizing kingdoms, not for a vain purpose, but so that those who wanted to do better could find the place where they could actually get counsel as to how. Likewise, chapter 5 was going to talk about how his ruler was going to be established on that mountain, seeming to point forward to, as we saw in Isaiah, messianic prophecies of the Christ. Now finding ourselves in chapter 6, having talked about his mountain and his ruler, he is now going to talk about what seems to be his indictment against his people, which, for time's sake, I might just leave with a rough summary, understanding that verses 1 through 5 seem to be a call for them to remember the history of him delivering them from slavery in Egypt and delivering them from the opposition to their future as their own independent nation, not just any nation, but a nation that he would grow to be the greatest nation on earth under Solomon, a nation whose greatness he would have maintained if they would have set the kind of example that he was looking to set for the other nations he was trying to save, essentially all of them. However, the rest of the indictment is going to remind them of the ways that they strayed from that example. Verses 6 through 8, containing probably the most famous part of the chapter, reminding them of the standards they neglected. Verse 8, most notably saying, "He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God." Going on to talk about the way in which, beyond the standards that they seem to have neglected, he is reminding them of the facts of their situation, meaning the things that they have accumulated in picking an alternative to the simple things he has called them to do. Most notably, verses 9 through the end of the chapter. We're going to park for a moment in verse 10 to talk about the treasures of their wickedness. Verse 10 reading, "Can I forget any longer the treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked and the scant measure that is accursed?" Going on beyond the evidence to talk about their deeds, how they came about, or stacking chips, for lack of a better term, or accomplishments in that way, saying in verse 11, "Shall I acquit the man with wicked scales and with a bag of deceitful weights? Your rich men are full of violence. Your inhabitants speak lies, and their tongue is deceitful in their mouth." Talking about the way that, once again, the wrong has permeated seemingly every level of their society. He is going to go on to talk about the therefore, the results of their choices, saying in verse 13, "He has turned against those he once defended, making them desolate because of their sins." Going on to talk about the way in which they get a picture, once again, of what him turning against them looks like, understanding the way that we from time to time say that the benefit of believing in God and finding his favor is that feeling, I guess, of some athletes will say being in the zone, meaning no matter what your efforts are, it seems that there's an extra oomph that just makes you succeed. The opposite, though, is in a circumstance when God turns against you. He describes something much like your opposition being in the zone. We sometimes call it Murphy's Law. It's one thing if it is just circumstance. It's another thing when God is the one that is causing everything to fail, which is what he seems to be describing from verses 13 through 15, as verse 16, the end of the chapter, concludes that it is because they have kept the statutes of Omri and Ahab, two notoriously wicked kings in Israel's, I won't call it far history, but these were kings a while back. However, the fact that they have maintained the ways of these wicked kings, as opposed to the standards that God is saying they rejected back in the more famous verse 8, seems to help explain why Micah may give us yet another example from the prophets of the way in which forgetting or turning away from God's fundamentals over time can eventually provoke God to turn away from even his own people.